This one thing to be undertaken, after much consultation among the chieftains, was the siege of Waterford. It had been summoned to acknowledge Duke Richard as its lord, and had refused. Keating was very averse to spending time before a fortified town. On, Boutes and avant. He reminded Lord Barry of his device, and strove to awaken ambition in him. The Prior of Kilmainham had spent all his life in Dublin, a chief member of the government, a seditious, factious but influential man. The capital to him was all that was worth having, while to these lords of Munster, the smallest victory over their particular rivals, or the gaining a chief city in a district, which was their world, appeared more glorious than entering London itself victoriously, if meanwhile Waterford, or any one of the many towns of Ireland, held out against them. On the 15th of July, 1497, the Duke of York, the Earl of Desmond, and the other many chief of many names, some Geraldines, all allied to or subject to them, as the O'Briens, the Roches, the Maccarthys, the Barrys, and others, assembled at Youghal, a town subject to the Earl of Desmond, and situated about midway between Cork and Waterford, at the mouth of the river Blackwater. On the 22nd of July the army was in movement, and entered the county of Waterford. The chiefs, at the head of their respective followers, proceeded to the shrine of St. Declan at Ardmore, to make their vows for the success of their expedition. The church at Ardmore, the Round Tower, the shrine and Healing Rock, were all objects of peculiar sanctity. The Countess of Desmond and her young son and the fair Duchess of York accompanied this procession from Youghal. After the celebration of Mass, the illustrious throng congregated on the rocky eminence, on which the mysterious tower is built, overlooking the little bay, where the calm waters broke gently on the pebbly beach. It was a beauteous summer day. The noonday heat was tempered by the sea breeze, and relieved by the regular plash of the billows, as they spent themselves on the shore. A kind of silence, such silence as there can be among a multitude, such a silence as is preserved when the winds sing among the pines, possessed the crowd. They stood in security, in peace, surrounded by such objects as excited piety and awe, and yet the hopes of the warrior, and if such a word may be used, a warrior's fears, possessed them. It was such a pause as the mountain goat makes ere he commits himself to the precipice. A moment afterwards all was in motion. To the sound of warlike instruments the troops wound up the Ardmore mountains, looking down on the little fleet that stemmed its slow way towards the harbour of Waterford. The ladies were left alone with few attendants. The young Duchess gazed on that band of departing warriors, whose sole standard was the spotless rose. They were soon lost in the foldings of the hills. Again they emerged. Her straining eye caught them. That little speck upon the mountainside contained the sole hope and joy of her life, exposed to danger for the sake of a little good. For Catherine, accustomed to the sight of armies, and to the companionship of chiefs and rulers, detected at once the small chance there was that these men could bring to terms a strongly fortified city, but resignation supplied the place of hope. She believed that Richard would be spared, and but for his own sake she cared little whether a remote home in Ireland or a palace in England received them. She looked again on the mountain path. No smallest moving object gave sign of life. The sunlight slept upon the heathy uplands. The grey rocks stood in shadowy grandeur. Catherine sighed and turned again to the chapel, to offer still more fervent prayers, that on this beauteous earth, beneath this bright genial heaven, she might not be left desolate, whatever else her fortune, that Richard might be hers. The army which the Earl of Desmond led against Waterford did not consist of more than 2,000 men. With these he invested the western division of the city. Richard, with his peculiar troop, took his position at the extremity of this line, nearest passage, close to Lombard's Marsh, there to protect the disembarkment of troops from the fleet. Neither party failed in zeal or activity. The first days were actively employed in erecting works, and bringing the cannon to play upon the town. On the third, in the very midst of their labours, while the Earl in his litter was carried close under the walls among the pioneers, and Lord Barry in his eagerness seized a spade and began to work, signals of attack were made from the town, and the troops poured out from the nearest gate. The advanced guard were too few to contend with them. They were driven back on the entrenchments. The citizens were full of fury and indignation. They rushed forward with loud cries, and created a confusion, which Desmond and Lord Barry were not slow to encounter. They brought a few regular troops to stand the assault. A well-pointed cannon from the town swept the thin lines. They fell back. A yell of victory was raised by the men of Waterford. It reached the outpost of Duke Richard. He, with a score of men, 5 among them with himself, being cavaliers armed at all points, were viewing a portion of the walls that seemed most open to assault. the roar of cannon and the clash of arms called him to more perilous occupation. He galloped towards the scene of action, and while still the faltering men of Desmond were ashamed to fly, yet dared not stand, he, with his little troop, attacked the enemy on their flank. The white steed, the nodding plume, the flashing sword of York were foremost in the fray. Neville and Plantagenet were close behind. These knights in their iron armor seemed to the half-disciplined Irish like invulnerable statues, machines to offend, impregnable to offense. 20 such might have turned the fortunes of a more desperate day. Their antagonists fell back. The Knight of Kerry led on at this moment a reinforcement of Geraldines, and a cannon, which hitherto had been rebel to the cannoneer's art, opened its fiery mouth with such loud injurious speech, that for many moments the dread line it traced remained a blank. Richard saw the post of advantage, and endeavored to throw himself between the enemy and the city. He did not succeed, but on the contrary, was nearly cut off himself by a reinforcement of townsmen, sent to secure the retreat of their fellows. Those who saw him fight that day spoke of him as a wonder. The heart that had animated him in Andalusia was awake. As there he smote to death the turbaned Moor, so now he dealt mortal blows on all around, fearless of the pressing throng and still increasing numbers. While thus hurried away by martial enthusiasm, the sound of a distant trumpet caught his ear, and the echo of firearms followed. It came from the east. His own post was attacked. Now when he wished to retreat, he first discerned how alone and how surrounded he was. Yet, looking on his foes he saw, but for their numbers, how despicable they were. To a knight, what was this throng of half-armed burghers and naked kerns, who pell-mell aimed at him, every blow ineffectual? But again the loud bellow of distant cannon called him, and he turned to retreat. A cloud of missiles rattled against him. His shield was struck through. The bullets rebounded from his case of iron, while his sword felled an enemy at every stroke. And now, breaking through the opposing rank on the other side, his friends joined him. The citizens recoiled. Old Reginald's tower, they averred, would have bled sooner than these Sir Tristans. They were charmed men, and lead and good arrowheads were softer than paper pellets on their sides. The first movement of panic was enough. Before their leaders could rally them again to the attack, the English knights were far, riding at full speed towards the eastern gate. Here Richard's presence was enough to restore victory to his standard. Flushed, panting, yet firm in his seat, his hand true and dangerous in its blows, there was something superhuman in his strength and courage, yet more fearful than his sharp sword. The excess of chivalrous ardor, the burning desire to mingle in the thickest fight, made danger happiness, and all the terrible shows of war entrancing joys to York. When reproached for rashness by his cousin, his bright eye was brighter for a tear, as he cried, "Cousin, I must have some part of my inheritance. My kingdom I shall never gain, glory, a deathless name. Oh, must not these belong to him who possesses Catherine? The proud Scots, who looked askance at my nuptials, shall avow at least that she wedded no craven-hearted loon." With the morrow came a new task. Their little fleet had made its way up Waterford harbour into the river Suir, and the troops destined to join his were partly disembarked. To protect the landing, he and Neville rowed across the marsh to the strand. On their return, a fresh sight presented itself. The ponds of Kilberry were filled, the besieged having raised a mound of earth to stop the course of the river, which flows from Kilberry into the Suir, and the road back to their camp was completely cut off. There was no mode of getting round save by the road to Tramore, yet to the active mind of Richard, it seemed that even this disaster might be turned into a benefit. He re-embarked the troops. He himself went on board the principal vessel. He called to secret council the captains. The conclusion was not immediately divulged, but some adventure of peril was assuredly planned among them. The long summer day went slowly down. The hum of men from Waterford reached the ships. The quay was thronged with soldiers. Several vessels were anchored in the Advance and manned with troops. But the English fleet, their anchors cast, their sails furled, seemed peacefully inclined. As night came on, the quay became a desert. The ships were worked back to their former stations. It grew darker. The city with its old rough tower and spires was mirrored indistinctly in the twilight tide. The walls grew dim and gigantic. The sound of firearms ceased. The last roll of the drum died away. The city slept, fearless of its invaders. At this moment, the ebbing tide began to flow. Assisted by the rising waters, Richard and Neville ran a small boat under the cover of the opposite bank of the river, to observe what defenses the quay might possess. The low tide at that hour was its best defense. A watchtower or two with their sentinels completed the guard of a part of the town, whose defense on that side was neglected. By midnight also the tide would have risen, but it was necessary to wait for the following night. For first, he must communicate with Desmond that a night attack in the opposite direction might effectually leave the waterside deserted. The vessels meanwhile dropped down below Little Island, at once to get out of shot of Reginald's Tower, which commands the harbor, and to remove from the citizens any apprehensions they might entertain of attack. The winding of the river concealed them entirely from the town. The next day, a burning August day, declined into a dewy night. Imperceptibly during the dark the vessels were nearer the city, and while the warders of the city fancied that the troops on board the fleet were finding a circuitous path over land to Desmond's camp, the stars of night twinkled through the shrouds upon decks crowded with men, arming themselves in busy silence. Suddenly it was reported to Richard that a stranger caravel was among them. She was the only vessel with set sails, and these were enlarged by night, till as she neared, she seemed a giant, a living thing stalking between heaven and the element beneath. A sudden shiver convulsed the prince. To his eye it was the likeness of that vessel which long ere this had traversed. He hoped in safety the western sea, stemming its mountainous waves towards the beauteous Indian Isles. Had it been wrecked, and this the spectre? It was the illusion of a moment, but it was necessary to ascertain the nature and intentions of the stranger, who was now close among them. York's vessel, at his command, got alongside of her. He leapt upon the deck, and saw at once him whom the dim night had concealed before, Hernan de Faro upon the deck. A thousand emotions, wonder, fear, delight, rushed into the youth's heart, while the mariner, yet more weather-beaten, thin to emaciation but still erect, still breathing the same spirit of fortitude and kindliness, grasped his hand and blessed the Virgin for the meeting. The questions, the anxiety of Richard could not be uttered in this hour of action. He only said, "You will join us, and we will be doubly strong, or must you remain to guard your daughter?" "I come from her, she is not with me, more of this anon." Rapidly he asked and obtained information of the meditated attack. In part he disapproved, and with all the sagacity of a veteran in such enterprises, suggested alterations. Now every boat was lowered with silent expedition, each received its freight of troops, and was rowed with the tide up the Suir. One skiff contained York and the Moor. The prince, in the anticipation of the hazardous contest, looked serious. While every feature of de Faro's face was bright, his animated, glad smile, his flashing eyes, all spoke the exhilaration of one engaged in his elected pleasure. Richard had never seen him thus before. Usually he appeared kind, almost deferential, yet except when he talked of the sea, heavy and silent, and speaking of that in a subdued tone. He now stood the picture of a veteran hero, self-possessed and calm, but for the joyousness that the very feeling of his sword's weight, as his right hand grasped the hilt, imparted to his warlike spirit. Had an angel, on poised wings of heavenly grain, hovered over the city of Waterford, gazing on its star-pointing spires, the reflecting waters of the Suir, the tranquil hills and woods that gathered round the river, he would have believed such quiet inviolate, and blessed the sleep that hushed the miserable passions of humanity to repose. Anon there came the splash of waters, the shout of men, the sentinel's startled cry, the sudden rush of the guard, the clash of swords, the scream, the low groan, the protracted howl, and the fierce bark of the watchdog joining in. The celestial angel has soared to heaven, scared, and yet honor, magnanimity, devotion, filled the hearts of those who thus turned to hell a seeming paradise. Led by Richard and de Faro, while a party was left behind to ensure retreat, another rushed forward right through the town, to throw open the western gate, and admit Desmond, before the terrified citizens had exchanged their nightcaps for helmets. In vain. Already the marketplace was filled with soldiers ready for the encounter. Guided by a native, they endeavored to find a way through the by-streets. They lost themselves. They got entangled in narrow alleys. The awakened citizens cast upon their heads tiles, blocks of wood, all they could lay hands upon. To get back to the square was their only salvation, although the storm and yell that rose behind assured them that Desmond had commenced the attack. With diminished numbers, York regained the marketplace. Here he was furiously attacked. The crowd still increased, until the knot of assailants might have been crushed, it seemed, by mere numbers. Day, bright day, with its golden clouds and swift-pacing sun, dawned upon the scene. In one of those pauses which sometimes occur in the most chaotic roar, a trumpet was heard, sounding as it seemed Desmond's retreat from the walls. Richard felt that he was deserted, that all hope was over, and to secure the retreat of his men was a work of sufficient difficulty. Foot to foot the young hero and the veteran mariner fought, one by the quickness of his blows, the other by his tower-like strength, keeping back the enemy. While retreating slowly, their faces to the foe, they called on their men to make good their escape. They reached the quay, they saw the wide river, their refuge, their vessels near at hand, the boats hovering close, their safety was in sight, and yet hope of safety died in their hearts. So many and so fierce were those who pressed on them. Richard was wounded, weary, faint. De Ferro alone, Reginald's old tower, which, dark and scathless, frowned on them, seemed his type. They were at the water's edge, and the high tide kissed with its waves the very footway of the quay. "Courage, my lord, a few more blows and we are safe." The mariner spoke thus, for he saw Richard totter, and his arm, raised feebly, fell again without a stroke. At that moment a flame, and then a bellowing roar, announced that the tardy cannoneer had at last opened his battery on the fleet from the tower. One glance De Ferro cast on his caravel. The bolt had struck and damaged one of the vessels, but the Adalid escaped. "Courage, my lord!" Again he shouted, and at that moment a blow was struck at Richard which felled him. He lay stretched at De Ferro's feet. Ere it could be repeated, the head of the assailant was cleft by a Moorish scimitar. With furious strength, De Ferro then hurled his weapon among the soldiers. The unexpected act made them recoil. He lifted up the insensible form of Richard with the power of an elephant. He cast him into the near waves and leapt in after. Raising him with one hand, he cut the waters with the other, and swam thus towards his vessel, pursued by a rain of missiles. One arrow glanced on Richard's unstrung helmet. Another fixed itself in the joint at the neck, but De Ferro was unhurt. He passed, swimming thus, the nearest vessels. The sailors crowded to the sides, imploring him to enter. As if it had been schoolboy sport, he refused, till he reached the Adalid, till his own men raised Richard, revived now but feeble, to her worn deck. And he, on board her well-known planks, felt superior to every sovereign in the world. Chapter 40. An Escape. Farewell, Aaron, farewell all, who live to weep our fall. Mort. On the height of the Tower of Ardmore, the white rose of young Richard kept her vigils, and looked across the calm sea, and along the passes of the mountains of Drum, in anxious expectation of the event of the expedition. Sad forebodings oppressed her. The sentiment that mastered every other was that her lord should require her presence, her assistance, while she was far. He had promised to send a post each day. When these failed, her heart sank within her. The only change that occurred was when she saw the Adalid proceed slowly in the calm towards Waterford. One sunny morn she from her watchtower perceived several straggling groups descending the mountains. She strained her eyes. No banners waved, no martial music spoke of victory. That was secondary in her eyes. It was for Richard's safety that she was solicitous. Yet she did not fear, for there is an instinctive sense in human nature which, in time of doubt, sallies forth from the ark of refuge, and brings back tidings of peace or sorrow to the expectant on the perilous flood. A prophetic spirit which, when it despairs, woe the while. The omen proves not false. The Lady Catherine watched anxiously but not in despair. At length heavy footsteps ascended the tower stairs, and to answer the beatings of her heart, Edmund Plantagenet and the Mayor of Cork presented themselves. They eagerly asked, "Is he not here?" "Nay, he has not fled," she replied, while for the first time she grew pale. "Weigh our words as mere air," said Owater. "For we know nothing, gentle dame, but that I must to Cork to bar out the men of Waterford. His Highness left us for the fleet, and the filling up of those cursed ponds of Kilberry, ill luck to them, cut off his return. Last night St. Patrick knows the deeds of the last night. Weary from our labor the day before, we were all too carelessly asleep when our camp was assaulted. Earl Morris had ridden to Lismore to hasten his cousin, the Knight of the Valley. There was some report of an attack upon the town from the ships. Havoc was the cry that roused the welkin from east to west. The sum I know not, save that we are runaways. The siege of Waterford is raised." "What skiff is that?" interrupted the Duchess. Round the point of Minehead first peeped the bowsprit, then the prow, and last the complete form of a vessel in full sail, yet scarcely touched by the wind, weathered the promontory. "Haste we, my friends," she continued. "The Duke may be on board, at least we shall have intelligence." "I know that craft full well," said Owater. "Her captain is a converted Moorish pagan." "The White Rose waves from her mast-top," cried Catherine. "Oh, he is there." "Holy angels," exclaimed Edmund. "It is the Adalid, I will on board on the instant." Already the Duchess was descending the steep narrow stairs. The villagers of Ardmore, with many of the soldiers who had fled from Waterford, were on the shingles, watching the caravel, now full in sight, yet fearful to venture too near the shelving shore. "They are bound for Cork," cried a man. "Oh, not till I first speak to them," said Catherine. "The day is fair, the sea calm, put off a boat. Ah, my cousin Edmund, take me with thee." Plantagenet had already got a boat from its moorings. A water was beside the princess to beseech vainly that she would be patient, and poor Astley, who had been left in special attendance on her, waited near with blanched cheeks. Accompanied by these dear or humble friends, the White Rose was borne with the speed of 10 oars towards the Adalid. On the deck, half reclining on a rude bed, very pale, yet with lively, wakeful eyes, lay the Prince of England. In a moment Catherine was assisted on board. There was no death for Richard. She was there, life of his life. So young, so beautiful and true. The celestial goodness that beamed in her eyes and dimpled her cherub countenance was not like that of an inhalant of this sad planet, except that spirits of beauty and love ever and anon do animate the frames of the earth-born, so that we behold in the aspects of our fellow beings glances and smiles bright as those of angels. Defarrow himself looked with admiration on the bending form of this lovely one, till accosted by Edmund, whose first question was, "Don Hernan here, where then is?" "My beloved Monina you would ask for," said Defarrow. "She who to please her vagrant father would have crossed the wild Atlantic to visit the savage Western Isles. Poor child, even at the threshold of this adventure we were nearly wrecked. She is now in England. She sent me here, to tell of rebellion against King Henry, to invite Duke Richard to his kingdom." Thus they were occupied on the sunny deck. The sea was calm, the keel almost stationary in the water. They were bound for Cork. Plantagenet and the mayor gathered eagerly from Defarrow the history of the combat. They learned that it had been expected that Desmond would have assaulted from land, while York invaded the city from the river. But the fellow sent with Richard's missive had been taken, the city put on her guard. Nothing but the desire of the citizens to do too much, and his own desperate valor, had saved Richard. They resolved at once to receive and destroy him, and to sally unawares on the Earl's camp. They hoped to make prisoners of all the chiefs. They failed in this, but succeeded in raising the siege of their city. Towards evening a land breeze sprung up, and 2 others of York's vessels hove in sight and passed them quickly, for the Adalid was much disabled and made slow way. Soon in pursuit appeared a ship and 2 corvettes, which Water recognized as belonging to Waterford. The corvettes proceeded on their way, but the larger vessels spied out the Adalid, and being now in advance of her, hove to, with the manifest resolve of attacking her on her watery way towards Cork. Defarrow, with his keen eyes fixed on the enemy's movements, stood on the forecastle in silence, while Plantagenet and Water eagerly demanded arms and exhorted the sailors to a most vain resistance. From the vessel of the foe, the Moorish mariner cast his eyes upwards. The wind was shifting to the west. With a loud voice he shouted to his crew to man the yards, then, seizing the rudder, gave the swift orders that made the caravel go about. Sailing near the wind, her canvas had flapped lazily, now it filled. The keel felt the impulse and dashed merrily along, bounding forward like a courser in the race. The ship, which had furled its sails in expectation of the combat, was in an instant left far behind. The other vessels from Waterford were still further to the west, towards Cork. All these maneuvers were mysteries to the landsmen. They gladly hailed the distance placed between them and a superior enemy. But as with a freshening gale, the Adalid still held her swift course towards the east, and the land began to sink on the horizon. Water asked with some eagerness whither they were bound. "To safety," Defarrow replied laconically. "An idle answer," said Edmund. "We must judge where our safety lies." "I have ever found best safety on the wide ocean sea," cried the mariner, looking round proudly on his beloved Clement. "Your safeties and your lords are, methinks, English-born. If this wind hold, on the 3rd morning we shall see the coast of Cornwall." The mayor was aghast, exclaiming, "Cornwall, England, we are betrayed." Defarrow looked on him with contempt. "I do not command here," he continued. "I obey the Prince of England, let him decide. Shall we engage superior force, be boarded, taken by the enemy, or land, be wrecked perchance upon this savage coast, alive with vengeful kerns, defeated men among a victorious angry people? Or go where we are called by your leader's cause, where thousands of men are up in arms to receive you like brothers, to fight for you with you? Where England, the long-desired kingdom, makes you welcome to her green, sunny shores? Ask your prince this question, let his word be law." This statement, upheld by York, brought conviction to the minds of Plantagenet and Water. The latter was aware of the risk he ran from the awakened vengeance of Henry, to pursue his having fostered rebellion in the city of which he was magistrate, and a moment's reflection showed him that there was no security for him, except in flight from Ireland. Meanwhile the wind, increasing in its strength, and right astern, carried them over the foaming waters. The early dawn showed them far at sea. They had outrun or baffled their pursuers, and though now and then, with anxious thought, they reflected on the comrades left behind, on the poor equipage and diminished numbers with which they were about to land in England, still there was something so miraculous in their escape, so unforeseen in the destiny that cut them off and carried them, a remnant merely of the war, away from its dangers, that they felt as if they were under the immediate direction of a ruling providence, and so resigned themselves, greedily drinking in the while the highly colored picture de Pharaoh painted of the Yorkist army which awaited them in Cornwall. Again upon the sea, again impelled by winds and waves to new scenes, new hopes, tossed here and there by fortune, it was Richard's fate to see one frustrated expectation give place to another, which, in its turn, faded and died. This constant succession of projects kept alive within him that sanguine spirit which never could be vanquished. Eagerly he passed from one idea to another, and almost welcomed the last disaster, which appeared but to pioneer the way to future success. During this voyage, weak as his wounds had made him, he talked of England as his own, the dearer because he must spend his blood to win it. Circumstances had an exactly contrary effect upon Catherine. The continual change of schemes convinced her of the futility of all. She felt that, if the first appearance of the Duke of York, acknowledged and upheld by various sovereigns and dear highborn relatives, had not animated the party of the White Hose in his favor, it was not now, after many defeats and humiliations on his side, and after triumphs and arrogant assumptions on that of his enemy, that brilliant success could be expected. This conviction must soon become general among the Yorkists. Richard would learn the sad lesson, but she was there to deprive it of its sting, to prove to him that tranquility and Catherine were of more worth than struggles, even if they proved successful for vain power. It was strange that a girl of royal birth, bred in a palace, accustomed to a queen-like sovereignty over her father's numerous vassals in the Highlands, should aim at restricting the ambitious York to mere privacy, while Monina, the humble daughter of a Moorish mariner, would have felt honor, reputation, all that is dear to man, at stake, if her friend had dreamed of renouncing his claims to the English crown. His cause was her life, his royalty the mainspring of all her actions and thoughts. She had sacrificed love to it. She taught her woman's soul to rejoice in his marriage with another, because his union with a princess was pledged to the world of his truth. Perhaps, had the time ever come when he renounced his struggles, she had felt with a pang that his lowly fortunes might not incongruously be shared by her, and self had mingled in the religion of her heart, which was virtuous devotion to him. But as it was, the idea never presented itself. He must win or die. Did he win, her happiness would result from the contemplation of his glory. Were he to die, the young hero's grave would not be watered by her tears. She believed that in that hour her life would cease. The Lady Catherine saw a vain mask in all the commonplace pomp of palaces. She perceived that power failed most when its end was good. She saw that in accomplishing its purpose in the cottage, or in halls of state, felicity resulted from the affections only. It was but being an actor in different scenes, to be a potentate or a peasant. The outward garb is not the livery of the mind. The refinement of taste which enables us to gather pleasure from simple objects, the warmth of heart which necessitates the exercise of our affections, but which is content when they are satisfied. These, to her mind, were the only, but they were the complete ingredients of happiness, and it was rarer to find and more difficult to retain them among false-hearted, ambitious courtiers and the luxury of palaces than among simple-minded peasantry and a plain natural style of living. There was some romance in this idea. Catherine felt that there was, and subdued herself not to lay too much store by any change or guise of outward circumstance. She taught herself to feel and know that in the tumult of camps and war, in the anxieties of her present vagrant life, on the throne which she might possess, or in the prison she might share, by devoting herself to the happiness of him to whom she was united, whose heroism, goodness, and love merited all her affection, she was performing the part assigned to her on earth, and securing a portion of happiness, far beyond the common lot of those whose colder, harder natures require something beyond sympathy to constitute their misnamed felicity. Chapter 41. Arrival in England. From Ireland, thus comes York to claim his right. If I am not ashamed of my soldiers, I am a soused gurnet. Shakespeare. On the deck of the sea-worn Adalid, watching the renovated strength and attending on the still remaining weakness of her lord, the soft heart of the princess possessed to fullness all its desires. While Monina, among the wild, rude Cornish rebels, exerted herself to inspire zeal for his cause and to increase the number of his partisans, winning them by her thrilling eloquence, ruling them by her beauty and enthusiasm. She had found the whole population ready to second him, but fitting leaders, noble and influential men, were absolutely wanting. She sent her father to urge Richard to this new attempt, and when he should appear, attended, as she fondly hoped, by a train of high-born Irish lords, of gallant Scotch cavaliers, and devoted English warriors, he would be able to give a martial form to the rout of Cornish insurgents, to discipline their wild, untamed valor, to attract others by name and rank, and Tudor at last must grow pale upon his throne. With eagerness she awaited the fleet that was to bring the chosen band of heroes, when after a long and calm voyage, on the 3rd of September, the Adalid ran into White Sand Bay, on the western coast of Cornwall, and Plantagenet, at Richard's command, disembarked and proceeded forthwith to Bodmin. It was strange that the chief partisan of the White Rose should, on his invasion of the island, find a Spanish girl the main source of information, the chief mover of the rebellion by which he was to profit. Yet Plantagenet almost forgot his mortal struggle for a kingdom in the anticipation of seeing Monina. Plantagenet, prouder, more ambitious for his cousin than Richard for himself. Plantagenet, who had but one object, to be the guardian, supporter, defender of York, now wandered in thought far back through many years to their Spanish home, to his tenderness for the sweet child of Madeline, to the development of the beauty and virtues of the lovely Moor. Thrown apart by their several destinies, he had scarcely seen her since then, and now, in place of the dark, laughing-eyed girl, he beheld a woman, bright with intelligence and sensibility, whose brow wore somewhat the sad trace of suffering, whose cheek was a little sunk, but in whose eyes there was a soul, in whose smile an enchantment not to be resisted. She was all life, vivacity, and yet softness, all passion, yet yielding and docile. Her purpose was steady, stubborn, but the mode of its attainment, her conduct, she easily permitted to be guided. Edmund scarcely recognized her, but she instantly knew him, her elder brother, her kind but serious guardian, whom she had loved with awe, as the wisest and best of men. Now he bore a dearer name, as the unfailing friend of him she loved. To both their hearts this meeting was an unexpected joy. Monina had thought too much of Richard to remember his cousin. He had half forgotten his own sensations, or, at least, was quite unprepared for the power and effect of her surpassing beauty. After the first overflowing of affection, Monina eagerly detailed the forces raised, and dwelt on the spirit and courage of the insurgents. "They are poor fellows," she said, "but true, burning with zeal to right themselves and to avenge their losses at Blackheath. They are gathered together by thousands. They want merely leaders, discipline, arms, money, ammunition, and a few regular troops to show them the way. These, of course, you bring." "Alas, no," said Edmund, "we bring merely ourselves." "Could Ireland then furnish no warlike stores?" continued the zealous girl, "but this can be remedied, doubtless. Yourself, your leader, Lord Desmond, Lord Barry, the gallant Neville, tell me who else, who from Burgundy, what Irish, what Scottish knights?" The last word was said with difficulty. It made a pause in her rapid utterance, while Edmund, aghast, replied, "Indeed, none of all these, or very few. In a word, we have fled from Waterford in the Adalid. His Highness and myself are the sole English knights. The good old Mayor of Cork must represent all Ireland, gentle and simple to your eyes, our fair Duchess, Scotland. Her attendants will follow in due time, but these are but needy servitors." Monina laughed. "We came to seek, not bring aid," continued Plantagenet gravely. "Do not be angry," replied Monina. "There is more bitterness and sorrow in my laugh than in, methinks, a widow's tears. My dear friend, God send we are not utterly lost. Yet His Highness and yourself may work wonders. Only report truly our state, that the Duke be not too dissatisfied with our appearance. Tell him Lord Audley headed a worse organized troop. Tell him that Master Heron, the mercer, has no silken soul, that Master Skelton, the tailor, disdains a smaller needle than a cloth-yard shaft. And is it to headmen like these we have been drawn from our Irish friends?" cried Edmund. "Better return. Alas, our path is besieged, the very sea is subject to our enemy, in the wide world the King of England has no refuge." "That he is King of England," said Monina, "let none of us forget. The very name is powerful, let him on his native shores assume it. Surely, if their liege king stands singly in the land of his forefathers, at his sacred name thousands will congregate. He has dared too little when he had power. At the worst, even now, let him dare all and triumph." Her bold, impetuous language had its effects on Edmund. It echoed his own master passion, which ever cried aloud, "He is a king!" And once give himself that sacred name, submission and allegiance from his subjects must follow. Buoyed up by these thoughts, his report on board the Adalid was free from those humiliating details, which, even if he had wished, he would have found no voice to communicate to his royal cousin. Monina's task of imparting to her friends the destitute condition in which their sovereign arrived was even easier. "He has come among tall men," said the pompous Heron, "who can uphold him for the better king, even to the satin of his doublet." "And fight for him, even to the rending of our own," cried Skelton. "And die for him, as he must too, when all's done," said Trerafe. "A soldier's death is better than a dastard's life." "We will have our men in goodly array," said Heron. "Master Skelton, are the doublets cut from that piece of sad-colored velvet, last of my wares, slashed with white, as I directed?" "Slash me no doublets but with a Spanish rapier," squeaked Skelton. "Have I not cast away the shears? Yet look you now, good lack, I lie. Here in my pouch be a sharp pair, to clip Master Walter of Hornbeck's ears, if by the help of the saints we can lay him as flat on the field as his own grey suit was on my board when a-shaping, by the same token that he never paid for it." "In good hour, Sir Tailor," said Monina. "But the talk now is, how duly to receive his grace, how induce him to accept your aid." "Ay, by St. Dunstan," cried Trerafe, "he has ruffled in France and Burgundy, my masters, and will look on you as clowns and base-born burghers. But no man has more to give than his life, and if he waste that heartily, time was, and time may be, when villains trod on the necks of knights, as the ghost of Charles of Burgundy could tell us. Courage is the beginning and end of a soldier's catechism." Such were the chiefs Monina found desirous, and in their own conceit capable, of placing England's diadem on Duke Richard's head. Heron, the bankrupt mercer, who fancied himself the base-born offspring of the late Earl of Devonshire, and whose first deed of arms would find him Heron no more, but Sir John Courtenay. Skelton, a luckless wight, whose shears ever went astray, the true cause why Walter of Hornbeck paid not for his misshapen suit, and who, therefore, believed himself born for greater things. And Trerafe, the younger prodigal son of a rural franklin, who, cast off and disinherited, had served in the wars in Flanders, gaining in that country no small reverence for the good Duchess Margaret, and ready therefore to right her nephew. Besides, like a true hero, he abhorred this silken time of peace, and hoped to gather spoil, if not laurels, in the meditated insurrection. The noble passengers disembarked from the Adalid. "Welcome to England, sweet Kate, welcome to the country of which thou art queen," said York, "and even if her reception be cold or rough, love her for my sake, for she is my mother." "A stepmother I will not call her, dear my lord," replied the princess, "but the maternal embrace is strangely wanting on these deserted sands. The narrow deck of yonder caravel were methinks a kindlier home. May we go on and prosper. But if we fail, my lord will pardon me, if I welcome the day when I embark again on board the Adalid, to find, when the wide earth proves false, safety and happiness on the free waves of ocean." Chapter 42. Reception in Cornwall. Skelton, tease but going to sea, and leaping ashore, cut 10 or 12,000 unnecessary throats, fire 7 or 8 towns, take half a dozen cities, get into the marketplace, crown him Richard IV, and the business is finished. Ford! Am I not king? Awake, thou coward majesty, thou sleepest. Is not the king's name 40,000 names? Shakespeare. These doughty leaders drew out their followers, in a plain just without Bodmin. There were about 200 men decently clad from the remnants of the mercer's wares, tolerably well armed and disciplined by Trerafe. This troop obtained the distinction of being selected as King Richard's bodyguard. Skelton was their captain, a rare commander, whose real merit was that he felt happiest when stuck close as a burr to Trerafe, for at heart he was an arrant coward, though a loud braggart, and talked of slaying his thousands, while the very wounding of his doublet had made him wince. Heron was brave in his way. A true Cornishman, he could wrestle and cast his antagonist with the strength of a lion. He loved better, it is true, to trust to his arm than to his sword, which, in spite of his strength, Trerafe always made fly from his hand in their fencing lessons. Not the less did he consider himself a gallant knight, and had cut up many a yard of crimson cramoisy to make a rich suit for himself. He wore Monina's glove in his cap and large yellow roses at his knees. He called himself generalissimo, and marshaled under him full 3,000 men, who in truth had never set a squadron in the field, nor the division of a battle knew more than a spinster. But they were sturdy, discontented spirits, who valued life at its worth, which was even nothing to them, who had labored with all their hearts, till labor was of no avail, and who then left the mine and the furrow to carry their loud complaints to the foot of Henry's throne. They were better pleased with the prospect of overthrowing it. "Now, my masters, make yourselves heard," cried Heron, as he shuffled down a little eminence on a short-legged Welsh pony, the only steed he found he could back in safety. "His grace is within earshot, so you be loud. Long life to King Richard. Down with the taxes, St. Michael and Cornwall forever." The din was prolonged, ended, began, went on, as the prince arrived at the summit of the hill with his little train. Fair Catherine was at his side, Plantagenet, Owater de Farrow, with some dozen soldiers who fled from Waterford. Sure never invader came so ill-equipped. On the hilltop the illustrious wanderers paused. Richard hastily scanned the rough-suited multitude. Then, turning to Plantagenet, "Cousin," he said, "you told me that the insurgent army would be drawn out for my view. Is it not strange that yonder rabble should hide it from us? As far as my eye can reach, I see no martial discipline, no banners, no lordly crest. Fie on those drums. They have no touch of military concord. What makes our army so slack of duty, cousin?" Though no fault of his, Edmund blushed deeply in very shame. The approach of Heron, Skelton, Trerafe, and 3 or 4 other principal rebels cut off his reply. It had been agreed that Skelton, who had a gift of eloquence, should speak, and many words he used to welcome his liege. "We will have every man with a red rose in his cap, in a drag chain, please your grace, and give a sound lesson to the saucy burghers of Exeter withal. Not a knight shall live in the land, but of your majesty's dubbing. We have but to put to rout King Henry's army, to hang the false loon for a traitor, and to set fire to London and the Parliament. Such nobles as please to doff their silken cloaks, and don miners' jackets, may work, the rest shall hang. Their mere wardrobes, bless the day, will find us and your grace in cloth of gold, embroidery, and other rich garniture to the end of our lives." "We thank your zeal, my worthy master," said Richard courteously. "If our good troops do half your saying, King Henry must look to it." "Are those men to be worse than their word?" cried Skelton. "There is not one among us but has the arms of 10. We are of a race of giants, please your majesty, and could knock the walls of Exeter down with our fists. Please you to enter Bodmin, whose very stones will cry for King Richard louder than King Hal's cannon. Tomorrow, God willing, we are for the wars." The royal party passed on, the dark ferocity or sturdy obstinacy painted on the faces of the ill-armed rout struck Richard as he passed. He became meditative, while Edmund, shamed and angry, his cheeks burning, his eyes on the ground, listened in indignant silence to Master Skelton, who fastened on him with such talk that whether a soldier spoke of killing doublets, or a tailor prattled of fashioning a field of slaughter, was riddle ill to be devised. At length they passed the gates of Bodmin, and here was a louder cry of welcome from the shrill voices of women, who held up their thin hands and half-starved children, crying for vengeance on Tudor, blessing the sweet faces of Richard and his lovely wife. York's eyes flashed again with their wonted fires. His creative spirit had found materials here to work some project, all poor and rude as they might seem. They entered the town hall, when, by some sudden revulsion in the tide of the crowd, every Cornishman fell back, closed the doors, and left the wanderers alone. Something was forgotten surely, for Heron had paced pompously up to Richard, when suddenly he turned on his heel, crying, "A word, my masters!" And all were gone. The Lady Catherine had marked their backing and hurrying with becoming gravity, but when the door was fairly shut, she could restrain no longer a heartfelt laugh. Richard joined in her mirth, while Plantagenet strode through the hall angrily, muttering, "An army, a rout of shirtless beggars, is this England's reception for her king?" "It were fine mumming," said Richard, "under a hedge with the green sward for a stage." "By Our Lady, this passes patience," reiterated Edmund. "Where are the gentlemen of England? Where the sons of those who fell for York? Are we to oppose these half-naked knaves to the chivalry of Henry?"